Hello, welcome to our lecture on myiasis and botflies. This is part of Unit 2, and this is Lecture 2-6. So myiasis, what exactly is myiasis? Well, it's invasion of living tissue with fly larvae. So many flies will actually lay their eggs on animal tissue, eukaryotic or warm vertebrate tissue, and once the eggs hatch, the larvae will consume that tissue for a nutrient source while they are going through stages of development. Lots of different flies can cause myiasis. Some of them require vertebrate tissue for growth and development. Some of them do not, but they use it anyway. They primarily use it because it's such a high protein source, and it's a really great nutrient source for many flies. Some will feed on carrion, which is dead flesh. Not all, but some will feed on dead flesh, and some feed only on dead flesh, such as some fly larvae. It's a really high protein source. Larvae love it. They use it for development and eventually for adult reproduction. With that said, there are different forms of myiasis, and which form of myiasis is occurring is really dependent on how involved the fly is and how dependent it is on the host. So let's look at what's known as pseudomyiasis. This is also referred to as accidental. Here, the fly larvae aren't necessarily going to be parasitic, but if they're in a specific condition, they might, such as fly eggs in food consumed by the host. So someone eats something and there's a fly egg in that food. This usually will pass through totally unharmed. Most people have probably done it and don't even know it. However, sometimes a case can show up where the fly larvae, maybe the egg was near hatching, and while in the digestive tract, the larvae actually hatch and begin burrowing into the intestinal lining. This can cause GI upset, diarrhea, cramping. Two flies that are highly associated with are the Drosophila, which are common fruit flies. That's this guy down here. We also see this with vinegar gnats or pomace flies, and they're oftentimes surrounding food areas. So you see a lot of flies surrounding food, particularly the Drosophila. They're notorious for this, the common fruit flies. You want to be careful about the food that you're consuming. In facultative myiasis, the larvae may be free-living, which they would be saprophagus, or they could be parasitic. This is really simply just an opportunity. There's a wound or a cut. Wild animals, stray animals oftentimes have wounds or cuts. You see this a lot in stray cats because they do a lot of fighting, and the stray cats are fighting, and so they have these open wounds. Flies see an opportunity and they lay their eggs on it if they can. Again, really rich, dense protein nutrient source. That would cause invasion of sores that are already existing, injured tissue, other infections. They will oftentimes also feed on carrion, and so there are a lot of blowflies and flesh flies that do the same thing. In facultative myiasis, we're going to subdivide this into 3 different forms. Normally, all of these are free-living forms. So in our primary, the fly species initiates the myiasis. They lay eggs on the edges of an uncontaminated wound, so usually very fresh, just cut themselves. They do not reproduce in tissue, and these are the different species that are used in what are known as surgical maggots. In surgical maggots, these larvae will not reproduce in the tissue, and they will not eat, they will not consume living tissue. So the tissue has to be fresh, but not rotting, but the tissue also is not in part of living tissue. So there is a process with surgical maggots where they take sterile maggots and they put them into a wound they're having a really hard time getting rid of. Perhaps it may be infected or it's not healing properly, and they will literally place the maggots into the wound, cover it with gauze and wrap it tightly, leave it for 24 hours, and then take it out, and usually the wound is quite clean. So they actually are very good at cleaning wounds. In secondary facultative myiasis. These species will continue the myiasis, but only after initiated by a primary species. So one species of fly lays eggs and their larvae start consuming it, and a second species comes along and says, oh, hey, wow, look at that. The eggs are there and there's larvae already in it. They start to lay their eggs into a wound. So in secondary facultative, they're allowing a primary species to get things started. In tertiary, these are the fly species that are usually present just before death or just following death. They will finish myiasis after both a primary and secondary species have, and forensic entomologists sometimes look at the series of flies that take part in both primary, all three, in primary, secondary, and tertiary, the order in which flies occur on a cadaver. In obligatory myiasis, the maggots are always going to be parasitic, and they require a host that is alive for development. The two primary examples of this are screwworms and botflies, and I'm going to show you a quick video of a horse botfly laying its eggs. So this is what the typical botfly eggs look like. This looks like it's on a horse or a cow. I think it's a horse. And you can see all these little white spots here. These are all botfly. Yeah, this is a horse. They're all botfly eggs. And so this botfly is looking and watch the oviposition. You can even see the egg. It's just going to stick the egg onto the fur. They barely even land. Look at that. There it is. So we can see here on the left we have this illustration here of screwworms, and they kind of create this cocoon-like structure with little air holes here at the top. So we classify myiasis by the site of invasion. So gastrointestinal, urogenital, ocular, nasopharyngeal, auricular, and cutaneous. Here we have botflies. This is maggots in wound debridement. Here we have, looks like some flies in ear, and here we have in teeth behind in the gum line. So what causes them? Who's doing this? Really the muscids and the Ostridia. And the muscids, we're looking at root maggots, latrine flies, horse flies, stable flies, and your common house fly. These guys are all mechanical transmission of disease, but they're really causing is the myiasis. House flies are opportunistics. Stable flies and horse flies are also opportunistic, as well as biting and blood feeding. Latrine flies are opportunistic. We're talking myiasis here. And root maggots will do this in food and plants. In the Ostridia, we have flesh flies, blowflies, and botflies. These are the ones that are really the big myiasis-causing flies. So our typical life cycle of flies, they actually have they follow a good clock. They will lay eggs, and eggs will hatch in 8 to 24 hours, depending on temperature. Once eggs hatch, they will develop into larvae and be in a larval stage for 4 to 7 days. They will then remain in a pupa stage for about 10 to 20 days to become an adult. And all of these ranges here are very temperature dependent. So here we have our flies involved in myiasis. We have the black soldier fly. These guys, their larvae develop in carcasses. There are a couple of human cases of gastrointestinal myiasis, but their biggest impact is going to be in rotting vegetation and in decomposition of dead animals. Flower flies, hover, and rat tail maggots. These are a pretty big family of flies, but the E10X is the species associated with myiasis. Their larvae develop mainly, this is the E10X down here. Their larvae develop mostly in sewage. They like, feces, carcasses, dead stuff. They are related to gastrointestinal myiasis, which makes sense if they like to be in sewage. And larvae will hatch in the intestinal tract and then be passed in a living stage in stool. I see it a lot in some wild animals. The skipper flies, known as a cheese skipper, these guys actually really like rotting cheese. They'll get into cured meats, and they are the most common form of gastrointestinal myiasis because they lay their eggs in the cured meats. The eggs will hatch once they get into the gastrointestinal tract. The nest skipper causes a cutaneous form of myiasis, and they feed on birds. They can actually, enough of them can actually feed on a baby bird and actually kill it by through blood loss. And then we have, of course, the fruit flies. Fruit flies are the primary cause of accidental GI or gastrointestinal myiasis. They lay their eggs on rotting fruit, and sometimes larvae and eggs can be ingested, mainly because these guys are so incredibly small. So their eggs and their larvae are almost microscopic, so they're difficult to see. Root maggots cause myiasis, gastrointestinal myiasis, because maggots get ingested in food. Another one that's really, really small. The latrine flies, sometimes referred to as a little house fly, that's the guy in the middle here. There are 4 different species. They're sometimes associated with GI myiasis in really bad infestations where people are leaving food out, probably poor hygiene practices. You get a lot of house flies in that situation, and they could be consuming food that flies have laid eggs in. Now, this GI myiasis, particularly accidental, usually requires the ingestion of quite a few eggs. So it's not like someone ingests a single egg and develops this gastrointestinal myiasis. It usually requires a pretty large number of eggs. Then we have the dung fly. Dung fly cause a form of facultative myiasis, and they feed mostly on tissue that is dying. So if a animal or someone has a wound that is kind of putrid, it's badly infected, they may not be taking care of it, those sorts of things. These guys will lay their eggs in those wounds. There are 3 species that cause accidental myiasis. One is called a false stable fly, which is pretty common and can cause gastrointestinal myiasis in livestock. There is a part of the life stage of the false stable fly is its 3rd instar. At 3rd instar is where it transitions from a saprophyte, from eating dead tissue, to a parasite. And it actually, in its parasitic state, will start eating and consuming, preying on smaller larvae. So they kind of outcompete themselves. The Hydratia species have this strong metallic color, and they feed on really old, rotten flesh and some excrement. That brings us to the Calliphoridae, and these guys are quite famous because these are the blowflies. The blowflies are associated with dead things. So when you see lots of flies consuming, or lots of flies around a dead animal, what you're most often looking at are bottleflies and blowflies. They are metallic in color. There are the blue bottleflies and green bottleflies, and then of course there are the black blowflies. They feed on, again, carrion, dead animal tissue. They cause a form of cutaneous myiasis, and their major impact is in animal production. So animals that are out in the pasture or that are injured, have a wound that has been untended, or even wild animals, these flies will lay their eggs in it, and the larvae will begin to consume that tissue. The 3 species that are of the greatest veterinary importance are the green bottlefly, the black blowfly, and the Australian sheep blowfly. Their life cycle within a cadaver or carrion is going to vary by species. It's anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks, but again, this is going to depend on temperature. Say down here in Florida in July, it's going to be a very rapid life cycle, or in Florida in February, it's going to be a pretty quick life cycle, whereas in, let's say, New York in January, it's much colder, so we're not going to see the same type of life cycle and fly development. However, you will see blowflies in February in New York. They're attracted to putrid sores, really strong smells. They can cause chronic nasopharyngeal and urogenital, so upper respiratory up in the nasal area and in the urogenital tract, so kidney infections, urethra, that sort of thing. They can cause death, and the maggots will continue to feed on a carcass even after the host has died. They're pretty aggressive. Here we have the blow or bottleflies, and the life cycle of the blow and bottlefly has 6 parts: the egg, 3 larval stages, a pupa stage, and an adult. And what's important about this particular life cycle here is these blow and bottleflies, these are the flies that forensic entomologists use to determine a time of death. They are pretty much the first insect to show up at a cadaver or a dead body. A couple of semesters ago, we did when we do the forensic unit, we will have some roast pork out. The first time I did it, I was amazed. I was not even done setting up the bait, and there were already flies on it. They were there within a matter of minutes. Within the first 3 minutes of taking the pork out of the package, there were green blowflies. There were green bottleflies and black blowflies on the meat. Within an hour, it was almost covered with eggs. So this life cycle is very well studied and used by forensic scientists to predict a time of death or time of deposit of a body if it's outside. Now, this is all assuming a constant temperature, right? So this is all at 70 degrees. And at 70 degrees, these numbers are accurate. So these bottleflies are really important because, of course, they cause myiasis, and they can cause lots of different open sores. They also can feed on mucosal membranes. When they feed on dead organisms, carrion, and cadavers, they get attracted to dead tissue very rapidly, and the egg laying begins pretty quickly within the first probably 15 to 20 minutes that they have arrived. They are the very first insect to arrive, and that's why they are used as the key species in what's known as the forensic entomological succession. So what we have here is what forensic entomologists have determined. If a body was deposited out in the woods in an open environment, this is the order in which insects and which insects would show up. So the first to show up are the blowflies, second are the flesh flies, third are the beetles, and then, of course, last are the soil-dwelling insects. And this is over a very long period of time. A forensic entomologist is going to use different stages of development of the flies to determine a time of death. We will be calculating this and doing this actual procedure when we get into the forensic entomology unit. Now, screwworms. Screwworms cause lots of different problems, and there's the New World and the Old World. Both are caused by 2 different species of screwworm. The New World screwworm is sometimes referred to as the American screwworm. That's the distribution here in red. So southern United States, Central and South America. And then, of course, the Old World is in India and equatorial Africa. Screwworms cause what's known as obligatory myiasis. Females that are ready to lay eggs like fresh open wounds. The eggs are deposited on the skin surrounding the wound, not directly into it. This is a form of primary myiasis. Females will feed at the wound for the next group of eggs that they're going to lay. So the females will feed on the flesh as well as the larvae. After about 10 or 15 hours, larvae start to hatch, and they will feed on the carrion, or they'll feed on the animal for about 4 to 12 days, again, depending on temperature and other circumstances. The pupa will then fall off, and they'll pupate into the ground, and the pupation cycle takes up to 4 weeks. They're seen a lot in the umbilical sites of calves, animals that have bite wounds and injury and scratches. If an screwworm infection is untreated, it most often is fatal. Larvae will actually burrow down into the flesh and start invading organs, bringing bacteria with them. If they die off, symbiotic bacteria in their intestinal tract will start to cause septicemia. So screwworm is a really big problem in the veterinary industry, and a lot of time and money is taken to ensure that screwworm infections are treated. Other flies involved in myiasis include the nesting blowflies and the African blowfly. The African blowfly is usually referred to as the tumbu. In nest blowflies, they cause obligatory myiasis in birds. They attach to the outside of a host and then and blood feed. They'll drop off of the host for pupation to occur. So this fly is also pupating in the ground. The tumbu fly, the maggot, will develop inside of what's known as a warble. These are warbles here. You can see in this animal, this is a warble in a human hand. The warble is this cyst. It's like a boil or a cyst on the surface of the skin. And the females will lay eggs. They'll do this in sand that has been soaked in urine, cloth diapers. They're attracted to urine. The first instar larvae will wait for the host to contact it, and then they'll start penetrating into the skin. When they get just under the skin is where they develop this kind of warble-like bump. These sarcophagi are the flesh flies. You can see this guy just fed over here. They cause both facultative and obligatory myiasis, so there's species for each form of myiasis. The females are larviparous, and they're most often associated with feces or dead animals. They are the second fly attracted to a corpse, so these flesh flies are, if flesh flies are present on a corpse, then a forensic entomologist has a general idea of how long that corpse has been out there already. They do cause facultative myiasis when they deposit their larvae in wounds, or of course when they're ingested. A couple of them cause obligatory myiasis. The Wolfartia are the most important. They deposit their larvae at body openings, of course wounds and scratches, any kind of open skin. Mucous membranes are also fair game for them to deposit larvae. The maggots burrow into the subcutaneous layers, and they also will cause some type of cyst formation or like a warble-like. The cyst surrounds a whole bunch of larvae, and at the top of the at the top of the cyst in this bump will be a single breathing hole, and that's for oxygen exchange, and several larvae will actually be within a single cyst. Skin botflies, there's quite a few different species of them. You can see here we have some more of these cyst-like structures. You see these on squirrels, right? So we have botflies, and they have these large kind of scab-like coatings on the outside. The primary hosts are rodents, mostly rabbits and squirrels. And after the third instar larvae, they'll fall to the ground and they will begin pupation. The warble that contained the larvae will then start to heal up. In the old world botfly, we have the cattle grubs, the northern and the common. They're really a big problem. There's a very major economic impact. There's a livestock pest, and they're referred to sometimes as heel flies and gadflies. The losses are really because of heavy infestations. So up here in this top right, we can see this cow here is kicking, and you can see why it would be called a heel fly, whipping the tail around, running around, and that's because these botflies bite. And they do lay their eggs on them. You can see the eggs down here. Here are eggs laid on a hair shaft. And here you can see, looks like about the knee of a calf here. And it's covered in these botfly eggs. The hide gets damaged, so there's loss there in the leather industry. Sometimes these cattle will actually, they'll be trying so hard to get away from these flies that they'll actually hurt themselves, harm themselves, pull a muscle or a tendon, break a leg, fall down, all kinds of stuff. Sometimes there's a expression in cattle that's called gadding. And gadding is when a calf or a cow is actually running around almost in a panic because they're trying to avoid these flies. They'll even go in, they've been known to drown in lakes and rivers because they've gone into the water and they get trapped in the water and can't get out, and they end up drowning because they were trying to get away from flies. Some of them will lay eggs in rows on hairs of the lower body region. So that's what we've got down here. That's the Hypoderma lineatum. The Hypoderma bovis lay single eggs on hairs in the lower region. So some lay them in rows. That's where we have lineatum over here on the right, and then the bovis lays them singly on hairs, and that's what you're seeing down here at the bottom right. Other botflies include the nose botfly. This subfamily contains 9 different genera and over 30 species. They are usually somewhat species specific, and they can parasitize all kinds of different warm-blooded mammals such as elephants, sheep. There's one that's known to infect kangaroos. They prevent grazing. You can see here, this looks like one. You can see these larvae are up in the upper nasal cavity of this particular animal here. They cause the animals to be unable to graze. They have trouble breathing. They can have respiratory issues. The mature larvae are oftentimes sneezed out. So they get in this upper respiratory in these giant nasal cavities. Think about a horse. Horses have really big nasal cavities. And so the horse starts to sneeze this thing, and they will actually sneeze them out. And when the larvae are sneezed out, they will pupate in the soil. The sheep nose bot is probably the most economically important botfly in the world, and it is the most widely distributed. It's a big problem in the sheep industry. The stomach botfly is found a lot in horses, and in the stomach botfly, these guys look a lot like honeybees. And they are the largest genus, the horse ones, and they enter the horse orally through ingestion. So somehow the horse, they'll lay eggs on, they will lay eggs on grass material, often also on feces, and they enter orally. So the eggs are sometimes laid on hairs, and they can lay them on the grasses. The stomach botfly, found primarily in horses, at least the largest genre are of major economic impact in the equine industry. These botflies look a lot like honeybees, and they lay their eggs on the lower extremities of horses. They also will bite, and this causes the horse to chew at their legs. When they chew at their legs, they end up ingesting the stomach botfly. So they enter orally. The maggots, once the maggots get in, they'll usually burrow either into tissue within the mouth, or they'll actually burrow into the GI mucosa. This causes inflammation. It causes the tissue to start kind of breaking down and sloughing off, and ulcers to form. You can see down here, this is a horse stomach that's filled with larvae. Most of the time, they will, if they're in colder climates, they will literally overwinter inside of the horse. So they kind of go dormant for a little bit in this larval form. When they're mature, they will exit the host and pupate in feces, in soil just below the feces. But maggots do have some clinical use. Because they are capable of consuming necrotic tissue, maggots can sometimes be raised in a sterile environment, so they are sterilized, and they're used for wound debridement. They are used for wounds that are recurring, a lot of times in diabetics. They have, in diabetic neuropathy and such, they'll have wounds on their feet. And these wounds are really difficult to treat because of poor blood circulation that occurs in diabetics. So they'll use maggots sometimes for these deep recurring wounds. Here we have someone who has gaseous gangrene on their foot. And so the tissue is dying. They've probably tried to debride it several times, so they're going to have to remove the tissue. So they do a surgical removal of the toes, and they start applying the maggots. That's what's going on over here. So they take these sterile maggots, and they apply them. They cover them up with tissue, leave them on for a couple days, and then they come back, and you can see after, right, here's during treatment. Look at how much cleaner that wound is. And then after treatment, it has healed up quite well. This is known as MDT, or maggot debridement therapy. One of the major costs and major issues with particularly like botflies and the stomach flies, those sorts of things, is control measures. The biggest issue for most farmers, because these flies cause a lot of problems in their herds, the farmers spend a lot of money and a lot of time and resources trying to prevent these fly infestations in their livestock. So the three primary control measures that are used are avoiding contact, early treatment. Livestock are inspected every day or at least every 48 hours if possible, just to make sure that nobody has any open wounds or anything. So early treatment of wounds and sores is really critical. Reduction or eradication of myiasis, because they want to by reducing fly populations. So they may use insecticides and such in the pupation stages. If an animal dies, they need to remove that animal carcass as quickly as possible. So pastures and areas in which the animals occupy on a regular basis are very often patrolled. And they will also apply different types of chemical measures. This is done through ankle bands, and these are insecticide impregnated ankle bands, ear tags. That's what we have right up here. This is an insecticide ear tag that's used to kind of surround this sheep, particularly around the head, because that's where a lot of botflies are going to try to get in. And so this ear tag here, it has insecticide in it. Here's another ear tag right here. This is an insecticide ear tag for cattle. Another method that's used is dipping. Cattle in particular are oftentimes, because their hind ends and their lower extremities and they're so big, they need to actually dip the cow. And by dipping, they don't actually dip them into a lake. They usually run them through a shower. And the shower that the cattle walk through, that drips down onto them, or they will walk them through a liquid, like a pool area that the cow actually has to walk through, and it will coat the cow in an insecticide that will help prevent or keep the flies away. Systemic control measures can be used. They can either be poured onto the cattle or horse directly, or injected. Injected forms are somewhat frowned upon and a little controversial, because if it's a beef cow, many people do not necessarily want to eat a macrocyclic lactone. That's what it's called. They don't want to eat an insecticide. So injected insecticides are still a little controversial. It depends on what the animal is used for. Livestock, of course, are at greatest risk, and the one classification of livestock that have the biggest issues with flies and myiasis are sheep. Sheep have to be kept shaven. That really thick wool that they have, and all of the oils in that associated with it are oftentimes big fly attractants. They have these skin folds that aren't necessarily always seen. So when they shave the sheep, they'll find these skin folds, and they will actually do surgery and surgically remove the skin folds in some breeds. This is called a mule's operation. It's referred to, the process is known as mulesing. And they do it to smooth out the skin so these flies don't get into the skin, because sometimes those skin folds, if they're not kept clean all of the time, if dirt or other debris get into it, which will happen out in a pasture when a sheep is out in a pasture, they will start to rub together. They'll get sores, and the flesh will get raw, and this will in turn attract flies, and they'll end up with a lot of fly infestation. Most monetary losses, aside from sheep, will occur in cattle. All of this fly infestation can cause weight loss. It damages hides. It causes a reduction in dairy production. And in the United States alone, flies are thought to cost farmers about $100 million annually in costs, between fly care, trying to get rid of them, the ear tags, the dipping, everything that farmers are trying to do. So the preventative costs in addition to actual losses. Screwworm eradication is being looked at through the sterile insect treatment, so through a sit method, and this is through introduction of sterile males. Cattle grubs are trying to be controlled by using compounds that will kill internal and external parasites. So these are called insecticides. They are injected or consumed by the cattle, and then destroys the flies if they get onto them. Think of it's very similar to the heartworm medication and flea medication that is given internally to dogs and cats. These are also more macrocyclic lactones. These particular compounds kill all levels of larval development, not just the migrating larvae. So they've become a little more popular. So that is myiasis. I hope the pictures didn't gross you out too much. It is kind of a bit of a gross lecture, but it is a major problem. Mostly in the veterinary industry, we do see it here in humans, but not like we do in cattle and in particular sheep. So farmers really do struggle a lot with ways to try and preserve and protect their herds. So I will see everyone in class. Hope you have a great day.